Phil, welcome. Welcome to the LGfL included conversation. It's great to be with you. Do you want to just tell us about yourself and your career up to date?
Thank you. Well, welcome to Manchester as well. Welcome to the Sharp project. I'm Senior Director of Immersive Content at Discovery Education. And that means I'm responsible for making content that draws the user in, that creates that immersive experience. And at the moment, we would think of that as augmented reality. In the past, we've dabbled with virtual reality, but it's anything that creates that connection with the user and of the content itself.
So has your whole career been at Discovery Education?
No, my whole career has been involved in education inside the classroom and out of the classroom, and with various companies as well, and of course with a long partnership with London Grid for Learning, with LGfL, now National Grid for Learning, and as Inspiro. And we got the attention of Discovery Education, and they acquired Inspiro in 2019. And so since then, we've been playing on perhaps a bigger playing field that's taken the product and our concepts global as well. And most recently with our immersive pilot, which of course saw LGfL as the global pioneer of this approach around immersive content and taking it a bit further into the classroom.
Thanks, Phil. So when we say immersive technology, what are we really talking about here?
Immersive technology or immersive content, because I think that it's a very good distinction. Immersive technology can be anything. If anyone's listening to this with a pair of headphones on, you are using immersive technology. And because you will have produced this, they're listening to it in super high quality sound right now. So that's immersive. And then it's over to me as to use this technology and to create a relationship with this microphone in order to make you listen to what I'm saying and the way I'm saying it. Expand that out to video, to animation, to imagery, to 3D models, then using the technological opportunities afforded by things like augmented reality, and we can amplify all of that together and package it all and like present it as this big immersive thing that makes you go, oh, wow. What's happening? What's happening? And that's immersion. So that's what we're always trying to do, is bring technology together to facilitate content production techniques that immerse the student and the teacher and any user in what we're presenting in front of them.
I think that's really helpful just to go through that, because I think for many people, when we talk about immersive technologies, they'll either think virtual reality headsets, or augmented reality, which is perhaps becoming more and more popular, where I would describe it as we have something like an iPad that's a window into an immersive world. But your take is a much broader one, and immersion, the idea of immersion in relation to the learner. How does that help them?
We talk about immersion as something that happens inside your head, inside your mind. So that's all we can do is prompt that experience. So if you're learning something, if you're being presented with the acquisition of knowledge, then how do you embed some of those concepts quickly and efficiently, but also with impact? If you can create some immersion around that. So for example, if we're looking at a content that we've done together in the past, I'm thinking particularly of fossils and dinosaurs, where we created a plesiosaur encounter. And it's like, well, what is a plesiosaur? It's like, okay, well, you can go to a museum, and we did. We went to a museum and we filmed and we saw Percy the plesiosaur. Fantastic, but it's a skeleton. And you don't really get a sense. There is some sense of what it was like, but what would it be like to actually swim with a plesiosaur in its environment 90+ million years ago? So together we came up with a plesiosaur encounter, and we dropped the time pod into the ocean, and we took a DNA sample from a plesiosaur. Now that happening in an immersive environment, in that case virtual reality, is powerful. You don't forget your plesiosaur encounter, and in fact your memories of it are confused, because you actually might have a memory that you think, oh yeah, I know, I've swum with a plesiosaur in a time pod capsule under the ocean 90 million years ago, and of course you haven't. But the thing is that memory is powerful, and that experience is powerful, and we know that learning from experience amplifies the whole process and just catapults you forward in acquiring the knowledge and then using that knowledge in some way and expressing that knowledge as well, which is important, how you express it.
So that's a really helpful introduction, really, to the role of immersion, both in the context of teaching and learning, and I want to come back to both of those particular strands. You are the person that first introduced me to the concept of universal design for learning, and you very powerfully put into the proposals when we were commissioning new immersive content at LGfL. You were the first person that talked about UDL in that way, and I want to talk to you about UDL this morning, but before we do that, I want to be a bit more basic, because this is the included conversation. Hey, we're supposed to be focused solely on inclusion, and I think we both know that we've been talking about very inclusive practice all the way through so far, but let's be more direct here. Phil, what is your understanding of the concept of inclusion in education?
Well, I could reel off some definitions of inclusion, which I don't think is appropriate, because we all know those, hopefully we all know those definitions. To me, inclusion is a partnership. I'm sitting here as a supplier. I'm part of an organisation that creates content. You facilitate, commission, create content as well, and all the schools out there absorb that content. But in order to do that, we all have to understand what inclusion is. So we all need to do our part along the way, I think. So there are elements of inclusion that are completely outside of my control when it comes to making sure that students can use our content. And that means access to devices. So we need to make sure that devices are there. I can't control that. So in order to have an impact on that, I need to make sure that the content I'm creating is compelling enough that schools will want to make sure that students can have access to that content. That's the first thing. And then we need to make the content in a way that is inclusive. So we're not using techniques that are above and beyond what a student needs at that particular point. So we need to be appropriate. Universal design for learning comes into this, of course, at this point. So we need to make sure that we are universally thinking of how students will absorb that content. But we can't control everything. So it comes down to the teacher then having their understanding of inclusion and what it means to adapt and adopt our content in the context that's right for them as well. So I do think, some of these phrases are a bit hackneyed at the moment, but it's a broad coalition. It is a partnership of everyone understanding what inclusion means and bringing it together in a way that means that the jigsaw can fit in some kind of way.
That's a really interesting and helpful way of describing inclusion, actually, because one jigsaw piece may be trying their absolute best, but actually can be let down. Yeah. What by? Is it the software? Yeah. Is it the hardware? Is it the content? Is it the learning environment? Is it the learning culture? Yeah. All of these contribute. So that's a really helpful way of looking at holistically the idea of inclusion. But let's dig in now to universal design for learning, yeah. Phil. What for you does it mean?
Again, I could reel off some definitions of what universal design for learning is, and it's like looking at a common denominator that says if you design for learning materials to be accessible by this standard, and that standard is variable, then it will by default be available to everyone. So if I think of students that have very specific needs and I design for them in a way that makes my content accessible, it is therefore going to be accessible to other students as well. There are lots and lots of issues there. That's a very oversimplified way, in my opinion, of looking at universal design for learning. And the two things just overlap so beautifully, inclusion and UDL, because really if you think about, I'd rather design for inclusion than talk about universal design for learning as the dogma around creating educational materials.
And yet they are, in theory, they're the same thing.
Exactly.
The whole point of UDL is it's an approach to inclusion.
Yes.
But let's keep going with this, Phil, because I kind of hear it from a teacher's perspective about the UDL. Yeah. But my understanding is that we've also got these elements which are thinking from the learner's point of view, how can they respond? How can they respond? And I think one of the major findings we had this year from our pilot that we did together on the Sandbox AR platform, quite unexpected in many regards, is that the children really, truly became the creators of the immersive experience.
Yeah.
And it's not that that is a completely unexpected outcome. It's just the power of seeing the children take ownership of the technology to express themselves. And my understanding of UDL is very much about we've got to place significance on the way in which we allow learners to show and demonstrate their understandings. Was that your observation from the pilot as well?
Very much so. We go into things like this, especially with innovative products, with some assumptions, because we're not redesigning something that's been done before. We're creating something that's quite new and releasing it into the classroom with some assumptions about how it's going to be used. And it comes with all our love of concepts like inclusion and UDL and everything, what we want to happen. So, and providing, the biggest thing in something like this was providing agency. And it sounds a very simple throwaway thing to say. We're giving you agency, but we're giving you control of what it is. In order to have some form of validation in the classroom, we also then have to provide lots of what we call use cases. So in other words, that means preparing a worksheet on the Maya and a sandbox that's been pre-prepared, and here's one we did earlier and everything, knowing really, because we've been here before, that all that's doing is giving us a level of authority to speak to teachers. It means, oh, you get what we need. Thanks for that. I can see it. It looks good quality to me, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. And the children are thinking, oh yeah, that looks really good. I'm not going to do what you're thinking either. I'm going to do this instead. What you mean there's no stuff for Benin in there? No problem. I can see a shed here, and that goat, there's a cartoon goat over here. It looks a bit silly, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's a goat. What's your problem with that? And so they're creating something with it, and that's agency. That's how that transforms resources, and means that they are then building on what they're hearing from the teacher, what they're hearing from each other, and then reflecting that back to the teacher and saying, is this what you meant?
Yes, indeed, and we need to explore, therefore, the impact of that from an inclusion perspective. But just before we do that, I do remember really clearly being at Rockcliffe Primary School in Greenwich, and a Year 6 child really keen to take me into the playground to show me ancient Benin, his ancient Benin.
Yes.
And I thought, well, okay, yeah, that's great. Let's go and have a look. But I knew in the platform it didn't have any artifacts from ancient Benin. So I thought, how am I going to be immersed in this environment that he doesn't have the tools to build? And it was amazing because I was in his ancient Benin. Okay, there was some flats behind bleeding through on his immersive environment. He wasn't put off by that. I wasn't put off by that. But there were some animated blue donkeys.
Yes.
Now, Phil, why is that in Sandbox? That is not ancient Benin. But what I realised, and it was one of those moments, those trigger moments, I realised that it was the meaning that he attached to it. And he proudly explained to me, using, admittedly, an animated blue donkey, he used it as a trigger to show his understanding of trade in ancient Benin. Yeah. And for me, that's where things changed. Yeah. But let's go back to this idea of inclusion. Why do immersive technologies and content have a particular opportunity in terms of our approaches to being truly inclusive, both in our teaching and what we validate from the learner in terms of showcasing their understanding or deepening it?
Well, I'm going to go with carry on with the same example, if that's okay, because I'm going to use a story from Andrew Hammond, who a colleague of ours, and he talks about the child in the nursery, and the teacher goes up, and the child's there with the car, and driving the car, and he goes, "Oh, that's really nice. What colour is the car?" And it's blue. It's a blue car. Where really the question is like, where are you going? because the child is in the car. And I think that's the thing with what the example you just gave with Benin, is that it doesn't matter what your perception was of Benin, but that child, that pupil, had an understanding of they were in Benin. And that's very powerful, because we're levering all those elements of play and what it means, your imagination and all those things, and that's embedding the learning. And that's what's so important about it, about immersion, is that therefore it doesn't really matter that you've not drawn a picture of Benin that's completely accurate. If you think about it, that's another good analogy as well, is the child that gives you the picture and you think, oh, that's a lovely picture you've drawn of Benin. It looks nothing like a donkey or whatever, or the Benin bronzes and everything, but it's their representation of what it is, and it's their understanding in their minds of what it is. And that's what I think we're talking about. And that's why it's inclusive, and that's why we can use it in the same word as sentences that involve inclusive learning, because what you're doing is you're giving them something that really just goes straight into their brains, it's straight into their minds.
But if you're not familiar with using these types of platforms, and okay, we've been developing these platforms and thinking very, very carefully about curated immersive experiences. If you have no experience from a teacher's point of view, this potentially, the last, 5-10 minutes, sounds like, well, this is surely only going to appeal to the high ability, high cognitive functioning learners, and how is that inclusive? How can immersive experiences, or the role of immersive technologies and content, work for all learners at all ability ranges?
It's a good question, and it comes back to the partnership angle as well, and it comes back to teaching, and it comes back to culture and culture of teaching and schools. But it also comes back to something else which I think is a big part of universal design for learning as well, which is the teacher as the learner as well. How prepared are you as a teacher to be a co-learner on this journey of using technology like this? We're not talking about, and we're very careful, we're not talking about technology which is out of reach. It was in the past, and that was always difficult, but now we're talking about something that we're confident there's a user base out there. So if you have access, if you have physical access to technology, what's the barrier to using that technology to then deploy it in your teaching and learning? And that is about you being a learner as well, isn't it? Surely that's part of the journey along with the student that we want them to take. So you're exploring at the same time as them. You don't need to be in control. I think as teachers sometimes we'd like to be in control of everything, which is why we have all the materials and support resources that very rarely get used, because we just need to scaffold people into feeling comfortable about using things. And students will come away. I was at a school recently where it was thought that the children were going to be too young for this technology, and boy, they proved us wrong.
Well, I think that's a very important point there, and one I often talk about at the moment as teachers, as gatekeepers.
Yeah.
What are the decisions that we make as teachers about what we let or expose our learners engage with, and how much of that is about what we're really genuinely trying to do for the learner, and how much is that about our own personal confidence, our own experience, our own understanding? You've given a really good example there of potentially some gatekeeping going on, however, pushing through that and then actually trying it out with the children and finding that the reality is not what was perceived in the head from the teacher. And then if I could just bring in the work that I've been doing on PedTech, and with that focus on thinking really, really carefully about what do we seek to achieve in our everyday teaching and learning, and the difference between those two, and what is the effective role of technology. And one of the things that I'm grappling with since we've launched that portal that we've produced in partnership with Dr. Fiona Aubrey-Smith, one of the things that we're really kind of grappling with on this is, how do you balance out a really, really experienced teacher, hopefully who's really, really inclusive in their everyday practice, but may not be that experienced or up to date in their understanding of all of the facilities, features and opportunities that modern technology and the kinds of content that we might produce are. How do you tell a successful teacher, you know, that are getting the grades, all that accountability bit, how do we get them to have the confidence to stray, as it were, away from a tried and trusted path into a world they have no experience of, isn't particularly something that they would explore in their own time, but we know that for all sorts of reasons, if they're prepared to give it a go, great things could happen.
The teacher as gatekeeper is an important point. It's a really, really important point. And teachers aren't aggressive gatekeepers. They're gatekeepers because they're trying to do everything. And they know what they can do. And they know their subjects. They know how to teach. And if you took technology away from a teacher, they'd still teach and they'd still achieve results. They don't need the technology to do it. It makes it easier. And it makes it more enjoyable. It injects some fun. It injects some depth. And that's what's really important about it. So in order to persuade a busy teacher who is thinking, oh, I've got another resource I've now got to try and somehow shoehorn into this, is to make it really, really good and really compelling and really enjoyable to use. I'm a big fan of making things really, really enjoyable. So you perceive there's some fun to this, but at the end of it, the children have got some kind of either a deep experience, a deeper understanding of something, or they've got to that understanding a lot quicker. That saves you time as a teacher. And that you think, at the end of it, you think, okay, I use that because I saw some resources on ancient Egypt or the Maya. And as we saw, it's like, oh, hang on, I could use this to do fractured fairy tales. Oh, I could go into writing with this. What if we were to make a green screen environment? What if we, and so it goes on from there. If you give them a tool that's high enough quality, a resource that's high enough quality, it will develop a life of its own. And the gatekeeper thing, then the gate opens. And that's the key. And the whole point of immersive technology is to open the gateway in the head as well and allow the learning and the collaboration and everything to flow through too.
What a fantastic expression, opening the gateway in the head. But just to go back to this concept of enjoyment, you know, absolutely, of course, it's got to be enjoyable, but I think that we have to balance that out with some equally powerful, let's say, other elements to be able to push through with the gatekeeper. I mean, I always have this view when people start talking about, you know, when the kids love it. Well, you know, kids love TV and chocolate, but it's not necessarily good for them.
What did you know at the end of it as well?
Yeah, exactly. So
I couldn't agree more.
So let's come on to a founding principle of our partnership, Phil, which is interesting to reflect back on in the context of inclusion. Whenever we've worked together, whenever we've been specifying the new resources that we're going to develop together, one of the things I think that's always been really, really powerful is that we've always kind of checked ourselves at various stages in the development of why do we need immersive technology to do this? Are there other ways of achieving the same learning outcome? And I like to think, we may be delusional, Phil, but I like to think that check that we keep putting on ourselves at different stages of the production process is what has really held the relevance and the quality of the immersive experiences that we've been having. But can we just help people understand, particularly within an inclusive context, examples of where we feel we've used immersive technology where it's the only way to help that learner? I mean, you've done one already. I mean, seriously, how do you bring a dinosaur back to life? Well, you can animate it.
Yeah, so a picture.
Yeah, picture. You can do a cartoon. You can't film a real one. You can film kind of descendants, but they don't exist. Okay, it's quite a good example but you can give life, as it were, to something that doesn't exist anymore. But we've done all sorts, whether it be on the geography aspects.
World War I.
Yeah, so do you want to just take us through a few examples of where we've used immersive technology, where we've felt that we've taken the learner to a level of understanding or knowledge that you can't get to at any other point, and within an immersive context? I mean, it's not much to ask, Phil, but...
It's not much to ask at all.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Examples.
So, and I just want to start by saying you don't need to use immersive technology or content. You don't. You don't. However, I think it adds such a lot if you use it in certain ways. So I suppose it's a bit like our greatest hits, isn't it, of what we've done together. And I always go back to the First World War, the trench experience that we created, and that whole resource around bringing World War I to with a different context into the classroom for the centenary. But that World War I app of walking down a trench, very, very carefully created, so that it was not about the guns, it was not about the battle or the plans or anything. We set it very specifically on the eve of an iconic battle, the Battle of the Somme, 1916. But what we did was we built up everything we were learning about immersive content. So we built the atmosphere up intensely, over the top.
Yes, but and what was a key ingredient of creating that immersive experience, which you can't do in any other way?
Well, it was a combination, but the big thing that we brought together to it was audio, it was sound. It's such an important thing, you know, and people to this day always say to me, oh, I loved it when I first put that on, when that soldier coughed behind me. They always talk about the soldier who coughed behind them, and they turned around and there was nobody there, and it was just like, oh, I really am here. And then it was to introduce poetry, it was to introduce their opportunities to write, to talk about it. I remember vividly showing teachers in tears taking the headset off and being in tears at that. Children weren't, because the teachers had the baggage of certain other knowledge around what it meant, but the children was just starting that journey of understanding that. So it accelerated their understanding and their journey to get to that level of, oh wow, that's quite a thing, isn't it, to be put in that position, to think tomorrow I might die. And then to hear the poetry, to understand what was going on in that in Wilfred Owen's poetry, to understand the meanings and the gravitas behind it, the bathos, the pathos, everything around it was just like, oh, I'm starting to understand it, because they'd been inside a trench. That was very, very powerful, and that accelerated things for us, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've seen films like 1917,
yeah,
really, really immersive experience,
yeah.
All sorts of things. We could talk about that with the cinematography and the use of sound. But the other thing for me about the trench experience was that you were in charge of where you went in the trench.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than a linear experience that you might have on a piece of film, for example. But for me, the sound was key. And if I may now flip over and give an example of where I feel the immersive technology did something that you couldn't do in any other way. And that was during the pilot, when I was at Lawford Primary School, and we were looking at immersive experiences in a polar exploration context. And thank you very much, Phil, for building us a crevasse so that we could sync it in with all of our amazing content that we were getting from Anthony Jimman, our resident polar explorer. So it was brilliant that we had this crevasse, and I was working with some Year 6 students in the corridor outside of their classroom, and we configured it really carefully, where we made sure that the crevasse fitted the corridor, and then we had experiences where they would walk up and down, not the corridor anymore, the crevasse. And that was really interesting, and it was really good to hear their explanations and to hear their understanding. They just watched a clip of how to get out of a crevasse if you've fallen down it, because that's what Anthony had shown us on a video clip, all those kinds of things. But there was one of those moments that happened when I said, right, let's just try something else. And I actually put on, and this is not in Sandbox, but I put on a piece of atmospheric synth music that I'd composed. And it was unbelievable, the experience from the learners. They just like that. So I pointed my camera at them and said, I wanted to capture that moment. You have a fancy way of describing that
cognitive attractor.
Right, okay, there we go. And so I pointed my video camera and I said, what was the significance of the sound? And had a very articulate Year six pupil that said, I know that if you fall down a crevasse, it's not like there's going to be music playing, which was quite a good practical point, and showed, you know, quite a good, accurate understanding of the environment. Yeah. But she said, however, it really added to the whole experience. And I think that kind of links in with what you're saying about immersive experiences can be really, really powerful. Now, good teachers using all sorts of different resources, complex and simple, can have really, really powerful moments. Of course they can. But we've seen and have examples of where immersive technology can do that. Let's keep going, Phil. Other examples that you can only do, with immersive technology.
Well, I'm going to bring up where we are now, which is Sandbox AR. And what I experienced in a school recently was we had a challenge day, and it was very, very quick fire. So, and these were year threes. And this was the school where there was some concern that surely they won't be able to use this kind of stuff. And of course, by 10 o'clock in the morning, they were absolute experts. And all the time we'd set aside, you know, to introduce the technology and everything. By lunchtime, we were doing the afternoon's activities by lunchtime, which I knew was going to be the case. High expectations, that's right. So it was fantastic. But what they were doing was, so that they started to build ancient Egyptian temples out of the components that are available in Sandbox AR. Now, hang on, we've got a green screen. So they got the green screen out, and then they created their own virtual CGI, so virtual, a CGI studio in their dining hall, and then they started to be explorers and started to act, and then they were writing little scripts. And it was fantastic, and the teachers were experiencing something as well. And you could see this revelation happening. It's like, I think I get this. We're not playing here. Yes, they're having fun. Yes, they're really, really enjoying themselves, but boy, are they engaged in the actual subject matter itself and their understanding of the subject matter. Because then they're writing scripts and they're telling us what they're thinking about the subject matter. And that was very recent. And it was quite striking because, not to sound arrogant, I knew that was going to be the case. But what was fantastic to see was the gatekeeper function disappeared in a school that, and apologies to anyone that's, you know, one side of the fence or the other, a school that was 100% Microsoft, and which we had brought iPads in, now has a whole class set of iPads. And it's that barrier thing. The barriers came down. It's like, no, that is good enough for us. That is something we are now going to use. And we're going to invest in technology to enable then our students to have access to this content. And I found that what I like about that example is it's not like an amazing extreme example. It's every day we were going to be doing ancient Egypt and we were going to be maybe making a film about it, but it transformed it and it accelerated it and left them with about 3 days spare to fill.
But that's really interesting, and the comment about Microsoft, I mean, in my travels around schools in this last academic year, I can now say from direct experience that the best, most effective use of technology I'm seeing in schools that have a mixed economy of devices. Yes. And it's interesting, not that we're trying to do an advert for Apple here, but two of the pilot schools that had a very, very small number of iPads but had committed to either Chromebooks or Winbooks as a result of the pilot, which is all about Sandbox. They had invested in a class set of, or more actually, of iPads and are operating in a mixed economy, right device for the right application and that kind of thing. But just to kind of finish this off, Phil, I'm going to draw us back because you and I are quite capable of going off in more esoteric directions with this because we've been living this world for many, many years. Let's just come back to some basics here. And I'm going to say inclusion again. Just a few really straightforward observations or suggestions for people watching or listening this in the context of the whole approach to immersive technologies and content in education, some simple, straightforward advice that you can offer to help people engage?
Expectation is manage your own expectations and manage the expectations that you have of other people, and let the content and the technology, let it reach its potential, and take the brakes off is probably the best advice I think I can give. And don't be frightened, and I know this can be controversial, don't be frightened to play with technology before you then use it in anger. And actually you'll find that some of the things you get through play are incredibly valuable, and you'll find that the learning is happening already as well. But I think it's that to me, when it comes to immersive technology, it's a new medium, relatively new medium to the classroom. So you must allow yourself to be expectation free on the negative side of things.
But how does that work in the inclusive context?
Well, it means that if you're looking at, if you walk into a classroom anywhere a few miles away from here, and within a few miles away from here, you'll find an average of 34 languages, you'll find people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and you might try to manage their expectations of what they can achieve with the technology with the very, very best possible reasons of doing that, best intentions. However, it's better to drop your expectations of what they can do and let their relationship with the technology show you what it can do and what they can do as well.
Yes, and I suppose it's easy for us. We've seen, for example, the results from the pilot. We worked with those schools directly, but whilst you were saying that, I just was remembering turning up to the school that was looking at polar exploration. They didn't have any iPads, and I went in and I knew that the children had a good understanding of polar exploration, but they didn't have iPads, and so we had one iPad. It was my iPad.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I sat with a child and showed the endurance wreck that had been discovered that week underwater, and I said, look, I'm going to go and do some work away from the iPad about this to introduce all of this. Do you reckon you could have a go at building endurance whilst I'm having that chat?
Yeah.
And it sounds like a setup and I'm over-egging this, but basically I came back and endurance existed in Sandbox. And it is that capability. I think the thing about the play bit, yeah, it's absolutely true for the teacher, they need to play around. But actually, the children are not only going to play, but if you're very clear, as always, about your learning objectives, the children will play, but they will also play within a context. And, you know, as always, as teachers, that's our job. Yeah. Do we know what we want from the children? If you don't know that, don't bother with immersive technology, because you don't know what you're looking for, so you don't know what you'll be looking at that they've produced.
There's a really interesting idea around creating immersive content that I play with from time to time, and it's a bit controversial to say, but I think it's true. And it's true of teaching as well. There's a large part of manipulation that goes on in teaching and in creating immersive content. We are manipulating your mind. We are engineering an experience. And when we let pupils play, we're not just going, yeah, off you go, just do what you like. We know we're guiding that play, guided play. We are making sure that it's actually, we're putting them on a path to achieving what we want them to achieve, which is learning.
Yes, but that's very teacher-centric, Phil.
It is very teacher-centric.
But my observation of the Sandbox platform is that the learner has been in charge of creating that immersive experience.
How teacher-centric is that as well? Because that's the thing, isn't it? As a teacher, I'm manipulating a scenario here where I'm going to give you control. And that's teacher-centric. And then I'm going to stand back and I'm going to let you take control. Yeah. That's teacher-centric too. So I think we've got to be careful with terms like that.
Yeah, indeed, and duly noted, Phil. Yeah, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that actually one of the observations I had when I was working on the pilot with all of those schools is that if people like us, whoever we are, can take a few steps back on this, and if you just stopped someone in the street and said, oh, did you know that in this school here, you've got 8 9-year-olds creating from scratch immersive environments that demonstrate their understanding of an ancient civilization. And when they've built that, they then are able to share that for the rest of the class to be able to walk through, engage with, and experience that as well. And if you're not involved in this kind of work, that probably sounds a bit outlandish. Yeah, that sounds a bit like, well, yeah, maybe in the future, in 50 years' time, but it's now, Phil, isn't it?
It is. It's my favourite use of immersive technology is to trigger a creative response from a pupil. So we always get channeled into topics and subjects. So we produce resources that support topics and subjects. And why wouldn't we? That's what we teach these things. So of course we need them. But the best thing ever is that we're putting pupils in a position where something sparks and they want to create. And by create, I mean write, or make some music, or draw, or paint, or demonstrate their understanding through a creative outlet. And I think that's the biggest part of what Sandbox and immersive content has to offer.
And what a great place to end this robust chat, Phil. I hope that with our listeners and our learners, we've provided some interesting perspectives, possibly some challenge, but also have we triggered that spark of interest to go and explore? Because if you don't, your learners will.
Very, very true.